Okay, today I'm delighted to welcome Jo Holmes, who's Managing Director of Genee, that's Genee, and David Knight, who's the Principal Environmental Consultant at Investors in the Environment. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Hi, Gareth. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, hi Gareth, you're right.
The question before we come, because you both work on Investors in the Environment, that's the main theme today. But before we get on to that, I like to always start by asking, how did you both get started in sustainability, just to give our listeners and viewers an idea of your background. So I'll start with Jo, who I've known for donkey's years, but where did it all start for you?
Well, it started donkeys years ago because I was really young. I've been I was obsessed with horses when I was a kid. So I've always been outside and in nature. I used to go to this, I think it was called BTCV in those days. It was the Conservation Trust for Volunteers or something. I can't remember what it stood for. But I used to go and do volunteering and pond dipping and all that sort of stuff. And then I love geography. I had a fantastic geography teacher at high school doing GCSEs and Mrs. Williams, and she really inspired me about the whole geography topic. And then I did that at A level, and then when I went to do a degree, I didn't get the scores I needed to do geography as a degree, so I did environmental management because it was the closest thing to it. But I've always been into it. So I did my environmental degree in the early 90s, and then I got my first environmental job in 99.
Mm-hmm.
And that was for a brand new environmental trade association, which is where I first met you, Gareth.
Yeah.
The Environmental Industries Federation. And it was a really exciting project to be involved in. And a lot of it was really at the start of environmental industries, because we worked with the UK government at one point to help define what the environmental sector was, because they wanted to define it with SIC codes, etc. So so that's when I really first got into it, and then I set up my first environmental consultancy. I think it was about 2006. So yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It was, because the first time I turned up at one of those meetings with my new branding and company was 2006, and I remember you wearing a badge with this new name, Daxi Environmental. I didn't realize you were alumni of BTCV, because I spent a few months as a voluntary officer BTCV as well. So
I mean, when I was a kid, I got I did it when it was probably just so that my mum could get rid of me for a bit, and it was a handy babysitting thing. Because I used to do full days out with it and take you packed lunch, and it was all really exciting. And that's when I first met David Bellamy, and I was in the Lancashire Evening Post. My picture with David Bellamy, which was a high point of my childhood at that point.
Yeah, well, I built a dry stone wall in my garden, but I've never laid a hedge since I left BTCV. But sorry, David, we're rudely going down various rabbit holes, because as we say, Jo and I have known each other for a long time. So perhaps you could tell us how you got started in environmental and sustainability work, and how your career progressed.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Gareth. I think, unfortunately, mine's a total polar opposite to that. I actually came into sustainability by accident in a weird way. So always worked in business, mostly in finance, pensions for a long period of time, and then just moved around with lots of organizations. And then when my daughter was born, I thought I need to do something a bit more serious with my life. I wanted to form a bit of a career. I didn't like finance. It wasn't an industry that I necessarily got on very well with. A very good friend of mine, she's been into environment for a long time, kind of like your story, Jo, in many respects. Anyway, she had launched the Invest in the Environment project, and actually invited me to come and work with her to support what she was doing and to sort of get the project going. So started really with Investors in the Environment. That was my, I guess, insight in getting into the sustainability environmental sector. From that, then I have worked, basically learned myself, going through lots of courses myself, taking myself through everything I need to, working with businesses, been really inspired some amazing organizations who have, really done some, amazing things when it comes to their performance and how they've embedded sustainability. Became an energy consultant for a while. So I've worked with businesses, to understand their energy needs and their carbon reporting. I had an amazing mentor I worked with for about 5 years who took me through the ropes of all that looked like and what that meant. And so, yeah, so a lot of it's myself just been in the industry, working alongside some amazing people, working with businesses, seeing them do some amazing things. And yeah, that's how I got into sustainability.
Okay, thanks very much. And that takes us neatly on to what is investors in the environment. Perhaps, David, you would like to lead on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say at its core, investors in the environment is an environmental management system. That's kind of its sort of, its main structure. But we designed it with the concept of taking the systematic approach, but really looking to simplify the process. We have ISO 14001 and some of these larger systems, and a lot of small businesses, small SMEs really just struggle to get on board with that concept and to undertake something like ISO. So we took that concept, we simplified it, we made it easy to access that any organization of any size could understand what a systems approach looks like, how you can structure it around your organization, but more importantly, how you can build it in your own business context. So what does sustainability mean to you, and how do I do it in such a way that I can really demonstrate meaningful change, but doing it in a way that's actually representative of who I am as a business? So yeah, so it's an environmental management system. It has a framework and a criteria that businesses are audited against. So not only are you, to have a system that allows you to do these amazing things, you also then have third-party validation and verification, where we audit you against the criteria and effectively, sign off that you are doing the things that you're doing.
Yeah, and there's three levels.
Yeah, I was just about to put in, that is the thing I love the most about it. It's because it's so approachable. So because it's bronze, silver, green, we ask for more and more as they go up through the levels, but the bronze is not too overfacing. So it's that entry point. We always say, like, we meet every organization we work with where they are now. And so, if they're already far down the line, well, then we accredit them to that standard. But those who are right at the start, who are just going, I'd love to do something, or this aligns with my values, or my customer's asking me to do something, but I just don't know where to start. It gives them that lovely framework to build something to. Those criteria, as I said, they get harder to meet as you go through and get it more embedded in the organization. But that bronze is the best thing, especially, like, I work with loads of voluntary sector organizations, just is so achievable. And once they get hold of it and start the journey, they start seeing that it isn't really scary and overfacing, and that they can do it, and then they'll see the benefit early on, and then they build on it, and then they get excited, and then it really integrates throughout the organization. So yeah, it's that staged approach, I think, that sets us apart from others and is the most valuable thing for those smaller, well, not always smaller actually, there's those organizations right at the start of this who want to do something, but it's quite overfacing to do everything all at once.
And you mentioned voluntary sector organizations, but is it completely cross-sectoral, or
So
do you have a target sector to go for?
So I should explain my relationship. So I run the Northeast and Northwest branch of Investors in the Environment, but we very much work as a team across the country. And so we, as Genee, but II nationally as well, we work with micro voluntary sector organisations, or SMEs, right up to councils, NHS trusts, large manufacturing companies. So it's any scale. It works at any scale.
And how's it funded? Does it is it the SME? Do they pay to go through the process, or is there another source of funding for it?
Yeah, so it's on an annual membership basis. So most organisations pay an annual membership fee to be part of the accreditation, and they get an awful lot for that. So all of the resources, all of the training, they get their annual audit, they get their audit report, they get absolutely tons and tons. And it's they won't mind me saying this, but it was developed by a charity, so it's price point is really reasonable when you compare it to other sort of consultancy based things. So the voluntary sector one, for example, we worked with through Voluntary Organisation Network Northeast, or VON, as you know, in the Northeast, and they got national lottery funding, and so a lot of those were funded through that funding source as well. And there's various other sort of funding sources that are about, but primarily it's paid annually by the people taking part in it.
Fantastic. And obviously, SMEs are usually part of another organization's supply chain, and thus their scope 3 emissions. So if one of those organizations has a net zero target for scope 3 and wants to drive it down through the supply chain, how far do you think investors in the environment takes them on that journey?
Absolutely. I mean, investors in the environment will take them through the entire process. So one of the things, so we work with large corporates who are effectively doing exactly that. So to understand the broader impacts of their their corporate structure and the organizations that work within them, they use investors' environment at a ground level to get that sort of information and reporting element that they need. So all of that forms into their wider scope 3 impact, because they get real to up to date reporting and funding. The supplier that they're working with gets the support from us with the investing environment, so we help them to become more sustainable. So it creates that lovely structure. One of the things that we do within the framework itself is we kind of break it down into sort of 5 sections. So there's policy, which is leadership and governance. There's resource management, so all about how you manage your resources. That includes waste and travel, as well as your day-to-day resources, energy, etc. There's targets and actions. So we work with organizations to help them set targets and to build meaningful actions to actually work towards achieving those targets and objectives. There's carbon management, which is kind of where net zero falls in. But again, we help organizations understand what their carbon footprint is. But on the side of this is what our carbon footprint is, what do I actually do to make meaningful changes with that? Resource management then comes and feeds into that. We then have wider sustainability. Now, we do that in a way of projects. So we get organizations to start to think about social values, social cohesion, working within the community, looking at biodiversity and conservation. So how can I start to actually go beyond just what I do as a business to start to think about wider impacts that I have? And then all of that is underpinned by a communication. So how am I communicating both internally, but also externally? So how am I actually talking to my clients, my stakeholders, and my customers about what it is that I'm doing and how I can showcase myself. So when it comes to net zero, what we basically do is by actually helping you to understand your leadership and governance, we can help you to think about strategy, long-term development. That kind of then feeds into those targets and objectives. How do I start to think about my organization in 5, 10, 15, 25 years as it is to net zero at the moment? We help you understand in terms of your carbon performance. But as Jo was saying, at bronze, we really come into foundational, and then silver and green, we start at that stage, get businesses to think about their procurement and actually what am I buying in? What does my wider impact start to look like? And that then starts to feed into the net zero narrative by starting really foundation, getting you to understand what sustainability is for your organization, just to get you started. And then as you develop and become stronger in this space, you then start to think about your wider impacts, because you can't really focus on those until you have a good understanding into what's my baseline, what am I doing? And then I can start to understand my wider impact. So the entire process will help corporates who are looking at their suppliers. It would even just help suppliers who need to actually feed this information into their corporates by actually creating that way of measuring and managing what you need to be able to then feed into these scope 3 channels, so to speak.
Yeah. And, what challenges typically do you find the small businesses come up against? What are the sticking points as you go through the process?
Well, small businesses generally, I mean, it's like I am a small business, so my challenges are no different to anybody else's. So it's resource, isn't it? So it's time and it's finance. So, they want to do the solar PV installation, but, they can't resource it. Or even like a lot of our organisations have really been impacted by national insurance rises. So that's like impacted on budget availability. And some organisations of a certain size, so I suppose the larger ones would like to have their own sustainability person in post, but I mean, they just can't afford to do that. So yeah, resource is a big one, definitely. But I would say, in terms of the smaller organisations, the smaller things they do will have a bigger impact on their overall emissions and budgets and cost savings. I always say when I'm talking to organisations, if generally speaking, if you do something for the environment, it is better for your pocket as well. Because if you're operating as a leaner organisation, you're spending less on energy, you're spending less on transport, you're spending less buying stuff in to use it to then put it in the bin. So you're saving all the time in terms of finance as well as improving your environmental impact. So, but yeah, for smaller organisations, generally it is resource and knowledge, and often it's like again, a lot of what I do is just calm people down and say, when I say, right, really think a waste audit would be useful here, they're like, well, what do you mean by that? I'm like, oh, it's just counting. Oh yeah, we could do that. We can count. So, it's that sort of thing. It's like, it's just sort of taking the jargon out of it often and just explaining really simply what we mean and why it would benefit. I always say when I'm doing it, I deliver this really practically, and I say if there's at any point you're doing something to tick a box for me, then I really don't want you to do it because it's not going to have any impact for your business. Like, it's got to make business sense. And you build that in, and the more you get through this and the more you see what business sense it's making and where it's saving in terms of overheads and things like that, then they really buy into it. But resource is a big issue for small companies.
You mentioned ticking boxes, and if I could be a bit cheeky for a minute, but obviously there's a plethora of badges out there. So what elevates investors in the environment above the others, and is there not an inevitability, if you've developed a standard that meets everybody's needs, that there is a certain amount of sort of lowest common denominator might be a bit harsh, but is sort of at the more sort of basic end of it, or is the green badge for really pioneering businesses?
Again, and sorry if I'm butting in, David, sorry. For me, what sets us apart is we aren't a tick box. So when you get our badge, I get lots of inquiries all the time, and because they're comparing us with other similar setups in terms of accreditations or schemes that they can get hold of. And I always say what sets us apart from those is, again, we don't just ask you to give us evidence to tick a box to show that you're at a certain level. We help you all the way do it. So it's like, we help you set where the framework is. We give you all the resources. So we never ask you you don't start with a blank piece of paper. If we say you need an environmental policy, we've got environmental policies you can look at. We say we want action plans. We've got action plans you can look at. Anything we ask, we've got templates for everything. So we hold your hand throughout the whole process, make it as easy as possible for you to integrate it. We take you through the accreditation. You do need to meet the criteria, but we help you do it. We don't just ask for your evidence to show that you've met that criteria. We'll help you through the whole process. And so what that means is you start integrating, you see a difference, and we start having impact. And I also say you've never ticked the box. You've never, just because you've got the bronze or the silver or the green, I'm sorry, like, we accredit you every year. So you're continually improving. We want to see improvement every year. That's what we're after.
Yeah. Well, and Jo, you're Genie's a B Corp as well.
Yeah.
There have been a few people drifting away from a B Corp system, particularly in the smaller end, because they find it bureaucratic. Is that ever part of the issue? Because we obviously running a small business myself as well, I know what it's like. And if you're starting to tender for things, it can be a nightmare keeping all these balls in the air and having to fill in endless assessment forms and things like that. So how do you keep it streamlined and light for the business so it's always working for them? They never feel that the tail's wagging the dog.
Yeah, so I did B Corp. I was interested in doing B Corp, and I'm like a micro organisation myself, so it's not typical for organisations my size to go through those lengths. I was interested one is it just aligns with my values. I really am banging the drum for SMEs because I hear a lot from a sustainability point of view, we're only small, or I'm in small strategic meetings and they'll say, well, we can't ask SMEs to do that, it's too much. And I'm like, well, I am an SME and I have done it, and I try and walk the talk as well. So I tried an electric car, and I've got photovoltaics, and we've done a lot on biodiversity, and so I'm trying to prove that just because you're a small organisation, it is possible and you can do it. But also I really was interested to see from an investors in the environment point of view how that fits in with B Corp, and it does, because again, B Corp's another one where you provide them with your evidence. They don't help you build the evidence. They don't handhold you along the way to get it. So I was interested how investors in environment fitted with that. Genee is a green investors in the environment accredited organisation as well. And the investors in the environment entirely helped us satisfy the environmental pillar of B Corp, which is why I was interested in the B Corp process. Yeah, I could see why people are moving away, and as we get more pressured and there's more things to think about in terms of small businesses and more financial pressures. But I just think it's a nice group to be in. It aligns if it aligns with your values, and you know what I mean. It's a good marketing tool as well. I think it's important.
Yeah, just one other thing I would say. Sorry, Gareth, just on that. So, I mean, in terms of the bureaucracy of creating these things, what we really look to do with investing in the environment, like I said before, is to make it part of your business. It's not an add-on. It is business. You know, the activities and steps and actions you take within the criterion framework are just good business sense, looking at your resources and measuring what you're doing. You know, building the strategy around a business plan with sustainability as your value. So when you're making decisions, is using that as the framework. You know, communicating and engaging with your employees and your staff. I mean, again, that's just business sense. Whether you have 2 people working under you or 50 people working under you, the same process you apply is the same. And again, you can use that to talk sustainability, health and safety, just anything about the business. So what we don't want to do is reinvent anything. We use existing structures that are just good business sense for organizations and just apply the sustainability concept to that. So actually, by developing the system, it just becomes part of your business. So we try to take out the bureaucracy, all the paperwork and all that kind of stuff that I think sometimes these things can feel like, and really just drive it down to, look, this is what makes sense for business and it makes you sustainable. So it just makes sense to sort of connect the two together. And that's really what we try to do within the program itself.
And the businesses that are taking part in this, are they largely, you know, is the driver for engaging internal, you know, the values of the owner and the employees? Is it customer pressure or legislation? What are the typical drivers you're seeing from the participants?
I would say all of the above. The vast majority of businesses who work with us have done it because they recognize that it just makes sense to be sustainable. That it's just you can't just keep doing the same thing and expecting us. You know, we think about sustainable development as a definition. We can't just keep using resources the way that we are and expect it not to have impacts. And we've seen the real world impacts that can happen when this thing is uncontrolled. So a lot of the businesses we have worked with have come on board because they know it's the right thing to do. But yes, we have organizations that have come through because their clients are asking them to produce a carbon reduction plan or a carbon management plan. We have organizations who have been asked by suppliers to basically show how they're handling waste and what they're doing within themselves. We also have companies coming to us because they're part of larger corporates, and those larger corporates are requiring their organizations to be more sustainably minded. So there's no real one driver that kind of fits everyone. It's, you know, a lot of businesses will come to us for various reasons, but I would say on the majority, it does tend to be organizations who are passionate or just have an understanding that actually it just, like I said, it makes good business sense to start thinking this way. So, you know, why don't I use a system that allows me to do that easily? Yeah,
I've seen an increased amount of the supply chain pressure motivation, particularly around NHS. They want to stay on the NHS register. I work with a charity, for example, and he said he's well into it. He's into his 3rd year of accreditation. And he was like, I've got to be honest, I really only signed up because we want to stay on the NHS register, but can really see how it benefits now, and he's so into it, and he's doing amazing things. But yeah, that was their key motivation. Whatever the motivation, it doesn't matter that they're doing it and they're making real impact and change. So, but yeah, I have seen a lot more in terms of that supply chain pressure being a motivation.
Yeah, because one of my interests in sort of sustainability badges, for want of a better phrase, is whether they take some of the data burden off the smaller business, because you hear it again and again and again, people saying all my customers want the same data in a different format, which suits their system, not mine. And is there any part of this process that sort of helps with almost either a standardization, or because you've been accredited by a third body, you know, giving some of that reassurance to customers, maybe bigger customers. And I know, Jo, you work with the public sector on supply chain engagement as well, that they will start to see badges like this as a shortcut to that's the sustainability bit, okay, rather than fill in another massive questionnaire.
I don't know about as any specific accreditation and satisfying in terms of the public sector. So what's happening at the minute is a lot of the public sector have got to grips with their scope 1 and 2 and are now moving on to scope 3. And then they're realizing that they're all using estimated data based, spend-based data. And then they're starting to see that actually actual data from their supply chains would be more accurate, give them a better picture. Newcastle Hospital Trust is a really forerunner in this, and they've got a 5-step programme engaging their supply chain. And they've got a really good response rate. They've got a really good response rate because they've been really quite bullish in their language and said they won't buy off anybody unless they have a carbon reduction plan and they're giving their data. So that is a real driver. Others have had really mixed engagement response in terms of from when they've sent out something to their supply chain, have had very low response rates because they're not quite so bullish about the language they're using. So what we're doing, we're working with Net Zero North East England, and we're working across the public sector to explore how best to do this. So just for that example, we don't want one organisation being asked for a different format of data or different language or different timescales or from all the different public sector organisations they supply. It would be better if there was some standardisation of that, and also support. Again, like my passion in this project is, we need to help the SMEs because you don't want to cut them out of your supply chain. You want them to be supplying you because often they're local and they've got a lower carbon footprint than some of the big nationals. So it's how you do it and how brave these organisations are in terms of the language. I know a lot of the local authorities don't want to come out with language like that yet. They don't want to say we won't buy off you. And sometimes, like the NHS, you were at that sustainable supplies event last week. Sometimes, when there's only 2 organisations that produce an MRI scanner, you don't really have much influence in terms of you can't say, oh, I'm not buying off you then, because you really don't have any other options. So we've got to work in partnership and together with our supply chains, I think, and help those who need it. And I just think programs like Investors in the Environment is just ideal for that because we handhold.
Yeah.
So it's not, it isn't like we're not there to bat anyone over the head or criticize anybody. It's about like really helping them along the journey, being able to give their data. Part of your accreditation is you produce your carbon footprint. It's just a case of slotting that into your supplier's data if they need it. So we try and make it as easy as possible. But yeah, it's a really interesting piece of work, actually. I say we're right at the start of it. We've been doing it a while now with the public sector. We just feel like we're really getting to grips with what's necessary and what's needed. And we're talking about a centralised information platform so that all public sector can direct to the same information and the same language and try and make it as easy as possible for all of these suppliers. Will there be one platform they all put their data in? I don't know. That's up to the public sector and how they want to manage it.
Yeah. I was going to mention that event that you and I were at. Apologies, David, while we talk about something, because Newcastle Hospitals Trust presented how they're moving from generic spend data for Scope 3 into actual data. And the really striking thing was how inaccurate the spend data was. It was about half, roughly, is what I took away, what the actual data was coming out as. And it's been a bugbear of mine for a while that spend data, the only way you can then reduce your Scope 3 emissions is to spend less, which may not be cutting your carbon. And as one of the carbon experts who were there, I was nattering to Aninja Chatterjee from Smart Carbon to give them a plug. They've been on the podcast before, but Aninja pointed out that it's even worse than that, because if you go for a slightly more expensive supplier because they have a low carbon footprint, your scope 3 emissions actually go up if you're using spend data because you're spending more. So I came away from that event thinking spend data was downright dangerous, to be honest, which I hadn't really thought through. And I don't know whether you've got any experience on that, or because once you start digging into that scope 3 data, if you want actual data, it becomes really difficult.
It's a really interesting. I think this is sometimes the challenge, isn't it? It's such a great idea, but we don't quite have the structures across the economy really to do it. Whenever I'm working with organizations, one thing I'd always say is, you're right. Spend data is not going to give you reporting data. And I think sometimes there is that separation between it. So if you're looking for reporting data, you do need actual data to report against. And I think, unfortunately, until all organizations are calculating their scope 1 and 2, we can't really get scope 3, because that's the whole point. It's someone else's scope 1 and 2 data. So often when we work with organizations, it's look, use your spend data just to give you an idea of what your hotspots look like, because they do align quite well in terms of hotspot identification, but not as reporting. Unfortunately, there isn't an easy silver bullet that's going to solve all of this. For ages, I've been calling, as you're saying, Joe, if we can get a centralized platform where data is available that anybody can access and report against, then this stuff can just be downloaded really easily. You are relying on companies to give you information. Now, what I will always say is, when we do work with organizations, actually with some businesses, we just, look, speak to your suppliers, have a word with them. And a lot of businesses are actually quite surprised that the suppliers were calculating their scope 1 and 2 emissions. They just never asked for it. So they didn't openly give it to them. So it is sometimes a case of, use your spend data to identify your hotspots and what you need to tackle as a prioritization. We talked about time and resource being a real problem for small businesses. So by only tackling the things you need to when you first start out, that helps in that respect. Speak to your suppliers and ask what information have available to them. If they don't have the information, then just signpost them to places where they could calculate their carbon footprint relatively easily. Signpost them to programs like this. There's lots of online calculators out there. There's lots of support out there for businesses to do this. And once we can get everyone doing scope 1 and 2, scope 3 does become a little bit easier to manage, but at least it's far better positioned than we are presently, where there just isn't that kind of reporting. There's still a lot of organizations who just haven't done their carbon footprint yet. So that's what we really just need to get that through. Just start getting businesses to calculate their carbon emissions, and then the scope 3 conversation does become something where, okay, we now actually have data we can start to use in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think spend-based isn't perfect, is it? But if we wait for perfect, we'll totally miss the boat. So it we start there, and then we move on to actual spend is the key to it.
Yeah, but somebody needs an algorithm that, as I say, that example Ninja gave, that you could go to a zero carbon supplier and officially your scope 3 would go up because your spend would go up. So there needs to be some sort of tweak, because that's completely counterproductive and doesn't encourage you to innovate in many ways. It's just,
I think
less stuff, then scope 3 goes down.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the whole social value sort of scoring on new contracts and things has been more helpful as well, because it's allowing them to it's not just a spend decision. They can look at, and the environment's part of that as well. So I do think that's been helpful in terms of new procurement and being able to influence it not just based on spend in terms of like new contracts and things like that. But yeah, like when everybody's bills went up because of the energy crisis, everybody's carbon then went up, and that wasn't the case. So
yeah. Actually, you've probably hit the nail on the head of why that NHS example we were given, why it was so far out, is because it's all assumes sort of a set a carbon intensity of whatever you're actually spending money on. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, Jo. So going back to small businesses and supply chains and tendering, as we talked there, do you feel these large tendering processes encourage SMEs to innovate? Because I've always felt SMEs are one of the big benefits in sustainability terms is they're agile. They're not held back by this large institutional inertia that big organizations get, so they can actually come up with wonderful solutions. But I sometimes feel that is crushed by particularly in the public sector, by these sort of very formalized, you must answer these 8 questions, and if the question we've thought of doesn't cover how you could do something much better than tough, we're just going to stick with what we know. Do you ever find that, or are you finding that buyers are starting to appreciate and reward innovation during the procurement process?
Yeah, so I mean, SMEs are fantastic at innovation. Like, I work a lot in the waste sector, and we're a really good example of innovation. And once if we get good solid policy in place and we know what the issues are, then the waste sector is really good at adapting and then innovating and investing like vast sums of money to meet the challenge. So SMEs are really agile, and I don't think this is. And again, I think that social value piece has helped in that, because they can really show what they're doing outside of their organisations and what they're doing for the wider community. Or environmental improvements, for example, is scoring much higher than it ever has in terms of new procurement. So yeah, I think they are still very agile.
Perhaps we have been bandying about a little bit of jargon, and I'm hoping that most people listening to this will understand Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. But perhaps you could expand on social value.
So social value is part of the new procurement. And so part of contracts now, I think there are over 5 million in the public sector, £5 million. Anything over that has to evidence that they'll give a 10% social value part of that contract. So a really good example of this, and we just launched the Northwest Resources Forum a couple of weeks ago. It's all a blur. Anyway, we launched the Northwest Resources Forum, which is the same model as the Northeast Recycling Forum that's been running in the Northeast for 35 years now. And we've just gone into the Northwest, and we held it at the Renew Hub, which is a partnership between Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Suez. But it's incredible. It's this big facility. It really encourages reuse. It gets material from lots of different civic community sites and centralises it all. Uses people with social issues or offenders or all different people from society to help come and repair, upcycle all these different products, and then sells it again to the wider community, or gives it to people who need it. And it is an incredible facility, and that was part of the social value project. So I think that was the Combined Authority went out to contract, and I think they put in even more than 10%. It might have even been 20%. I can't remember. There was a huge whack of the contract, and that's what they came up with. So it'd be great to see something like that in the Northeast as well, or across the country, to be honest, to increase that circular economy model and start reusing. So that's a really good example of where it's worked really well. But we're linking in with existing charities and voluntary sector organisations that are doing some amazing stuff, and it's just driving that money locally. It's starting to have an impact, I think. So it's really useful. But part of that is that you're evidencing your environmental performance, that you're not damaging the environment, and how you're evidencing that is really important. That's a driver as well. Lots of organisations have started really pushing this and seeing the value of it, because it's the difference between winning a contract and losing it.
And David, you mentioned the social value section in investors in the environment. So have you got any good examples of how SMEs have demonstrated social value as opposed to big corporations with plenty of resource to throw about?
Yeah, I mean, just because essentially what we're looking for is, any organization within these contracts themselves, they have to demonstrate how they are being a positive influence within the social community.
Yeah.
And that can come across in a variety of different ways, from looking after your employees to actually looking at the communities to looking after, the environment itself. I mean, again, if we're talking small businesses and things that you can do, I mean, it could even just be as simple as like supporting the local football team and actually, engaging in that sort of element to it. But a lot of it is a case of just recognizing what kind of charity and work is already out there. And as an organization, it could be just things such as volunteering, creating opportunities for your staff to have days off to volunteer within these community groups. Even if it's doing money raising days and then the organization and then donating that money to these charities. They don't have to always be super complex. They don't always have to involve lots of money. It's sometimes about understanding what the opportunities are, looking at collaborating within your local community, and then just working with the local charities, saying like, what support do you need and how best can we as organizations actually work with and help you? How can we partner if there's an opportunity to do that? And that's just what the large organizations just do really well. It's not, it's a lot of the times it isn't necessarily complex, although sometimes can seem it. It's just about knowing who to speak to, where to go, and just about making sure that you engage in the right kind of ways. And that's what we look to try to do. So as part of our projects process within the criteria is, we introduce you to these opportunities. We give you sort of guides and help, and maybe if you need to speak to someone, we can introduce you to the right kind of people to have these conversations with. So as an organization, you can sometimes just do really small things, but have a really sort of positive impact with it without actually impacting too much on what you're doing on your day to day.
Yeah, fantastic. Right. Well, I've kept you to quite a long time, and I really appreciate the conversation. Maybe not steered as in a straight line by me, but we've covered a lot of very interesting topics. But I just thought I'd ask you once, and you're banned from saying contact investors in the environment for this answer. But what one piece of advice would you give a small business owner as a first step? Jo, I'll start with you.
For me, I would say sustainability is good business. So it's not, as we said earlier, it's not an add-on. It's not a nice to have. It is a really a good way of demonstrating that your values are in line with other businesses. But it can be a difference between winning a contract and losing one. So sustainability is really good business. It's not just a nice to have.
Brilliant. Thank you. And David?
I wish you'd chosen me first now. That's what I was going to say. So working with small businesses, particularly as a consultant, the one thing I would say to any business who's looking to start is measure your resources. Front and simple, really simple. I know a lot of businesses will have their accounting, they'll pay their bills. And so you're already doing it, but maybe not as accurately as actually just looking at your meters. We see a lot of organizations hit with estimated billing, which, over the last few years, particularly since 21 and the energy crisis, it's such a dangerous thing to do because they could just be anything. So just take a bit of time, measure your resources, do it in a meaningful way where you're actually tracking and recording it, because what it means is that you can then measure any changes you make in a meaningful way. When you're putting information into a tender, being asked to report your carbon footprint, you have the data there, and you can also show the improvements that you have. So you can actually, it gives you something to track and compare over time. Plus it protects you by actually looking at, there's that old mantra that anything you measure, you manage. And if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. And that can lead to quite risky, particularly in business, and particularly for small businesses, which are, let's say, can be quite at risk to a lot of shocks and changes. Anyone starting out, I would say, look at your data in a meaningful way and just measure your resources. Yeah.
Excellent. That just leaves me to thank you two very much. Thank you, Jo, and thank you, David, for joining us today.
No, thank you, Gareth.
You.
Cheers.